Owing to the fact that between 3 a.m. and 4:30 a.m., the Russians had achieved for the coalition an enormous political objective within the Battle at Austin by capturing not just the Cap building largely intact for use for the Chinese colonial governor who would set to rule this particular region after the coalition victory, but also they were able to take the high-value individuals, all alive and well, to be handed over to the Chinese for an after-conflict tribunal, as there would be show trials held in China, and even Chinese allied regimes would have representation at these show trials because many of them had felt slighted by American actions in the past, and that would be put on the list of charges. As the Russians, bolstered by the 4 additional arriving combat engineer companies of their same battalion, of the battalion whose 2 lead companies seized control of the Cap complex as well as also the stretch of I-35 in the north of downtown. To their south, PAP forces had effectively fought a 3-hour-long methodical surgical campaign of going through each and every one of the large downtown buildings and clearing them methodically for armed resistance, as well as fighting in the streets against enemy combatants who dared to challenge them as they moved through the area tactically with a high degree of precision and supported by loitering munitions and even 2 of their Wing-Lung 2 combat drones out of the 10 committed to this entire battle. As the PAP forces took some time to go through methodically all of the large buildings in the city, in this portion of the city, namely the downtown along the Colorado River. To the south of this battle, the Russians in 3 different battalions, 1 armored battalion and 2 mechanized infantry battalions had moved through the area, clearing the entire south of Austin. As they now, by 8 a.m., prepared for the seizure of the final objective of the campaign, PAP forces had already cleared the Del Valle area on the flanks for this operation to occur without any harassment of the logistical and supply lines or forces. As they now had swept through Del Valle, they moved to the southwest to engage a pocket, an outcropping of another group of armed reactionary civilians whom by 8:30 they were now engaging in battle. Also at 8:30, the Russian forces had by now arrived and fully surrounded the Austin Bergstrom International Airport. As before the clock had even struck 8, the Russian forces were already getting logistically prepared for this last assault. Both this mechanized infantry battalion and these 2 battalions working hand in hand, the armored and other mechanized infantry battalion of the 207th Motor Rifle Division operating in the area, having moved through and cleared the armed reactionary civilian pockets who now joined together, prepared to assault the Austin Bergstrom International Airport as it would first be surrounded, and then different elements of the 3 attacking battalions would be sent in to capture the airport proper, leaving the rest maintaining a perimeter around the airport to prevent escape of the embattled forces or to prevent any type of reinforcements, even on an ad hoc basis, from any potential armed reactionary civilian elements from trying to get in there and assist them or assist them from outside of the cordon. As the People's Armed Police Battalion that originated in Del Valle of the 43rd PAP was moving through the area, again attacking now to their southwest west of where they had originated from, a small grouping of armed reactionary civilians who would retreat from the field of battle towards a town known as Creedmoor, which was near another outermost suburb known as Buda. And to the south of there was Kyle, which to the south of there was New Braunfels before reaching San Antonio. And in this area, it needs to be noted, as the San Antonio and Austin battles were inexorably linked in many ways, just as Austin, Fort Hood, and Waco were all battles that were linked together, namely by the use of longer-range Chinese 300mm rocket artillery strikes, which were enormous. These forces, moving north to escape the vengeful Serbs of the Serbian Army's 1st Brigade, as it was attached to the Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army forces operating south in the San Antonio battle space, was moving through New Braunfels and poised to move on Kyle when approximately 1,000 armed reactionary civilians, who would be joined by nearly 200 more, would enter the Austin battle space and end up being engaged by the same PAP battalion who had originally engaged the smaller grouping, who would be picked up by this larger grouping after this battle had occurred for the international airport. Again, this would be a battle that would occur after all of the major objectives in the Austin battle space had been achieved. And even beyond that, hours later, an even larger grouping of armed reactionary civilians, this grouping, an actual militia force, would be attacking from the Edwards Plateau, as they had outstanding high ground from upon which they could look down upon the city with binoculars and other special types of optical equipment. And they could see largely, with very few scouts, what was actually taking place. And for hours, they would plan their attack. However, much like other battles wherein the Americans would try to counterattack right away, it would not go smooth nor according to their plans, as the coalition had superior ISR dominance, as they had surveillance and reconnaissance and intelligence gathering means that were far beyond anything that anybody else could possess. They also had firepower dominance and more, as they, even on an ad hoc basis, reacting themselves to attacks, would always be ready for any of these sporadic, ad hoc, thrown together counterattacks, which were dangerously executed against an enemy that had total air superiority, firepower dominance, and ISR capabilities dominance, communications dominance, and even numbers, as they could call upon ample reinforcements from throughout the local areas within which these forces were engaged. As now we go to the map of the Austin Bergstrom International Airport, the artillery prior to this battle, both from Russian howitzer artillery from the 2S-19 MSTA, self-propelled 152mm howitzers, as well as also the Chinese Type 59-I or -1 howitzers of the People's Armed Police 130th Artillery Regiment, had only been sporadically hitting forces that revealed themselves out in the open and did not stay concealed in the buildings or the parking garages or other such important areas like runways, because they would not shell or hit the runways again, as these were needed intact. Only sporadically had the artillery been used up to this point by precision strikes that would not put the runways or infrastructure of the airport in jeopardy, as everything, again, like always at airport battles, was needed intact for use as infrastructure in the creation of the mega fob that would be built upon this location. As it pertained to the American forces defending the Austin-Bergstrom International Airport, the main body of the 1st of the 355th, minus of course its headquarters and support company, which was overrun very early on by People's Armed Police forces along with artillery strikes and even missile strikes from Chinese missile forces, firing DH-10A long-range cruise missiles at the compound, had effectively been nullified and completely destroyed, as in their command elements, and now the main body of the force was sitting, wondering what was going on, apart from the sporadic artillery strikes as they had tried to set up certain tents and other places for logistics and living areas that were outside of the main terminal buildings in the fields. They would be struck by both the Russian and Chinese sporadic artillery strikes. However, the 550 strong main forces of the 1st of the 355th, the American Reserve Battalion, comprised mostly of training forces and other cadre related to it, such as drill sergeants and also officers and enlisted who specialized in training activities, had been given heavier weapons for use as a defensive force on the Austin-Bergstrom International Airport. They were possibly even to have been augmented by some of the 2nd of the 198th, who was destroyed immediately at the opening of the campaign, just as some of these companies might have also been sent to Lago Vista to assist in the defense of the tech companies and the Rusty Allen Municipal Airport. Same went with the Austin Municipal as well. However, that was never to be, and they were destroyed before they could even get any orders, because the invasion had kicked off before any orders were sent down to them. As the 1st of the 355th, on the other hand, had made it to their deployment site, they were bolstered by an additional 300 paramilitary personnel from both federal and state levels, as in the alphabet, and also state paramilitary elements of the Americans, already there and providing security at the site, as, again, like all of the airports before the invasion, had effectively gone bust as the economic woes made it largely impossible for people to fly very often, and the airlines had begun to go under and were rescued by generous government subsidies, as well as also so were the airport facilities themselves. And as there was not a lot of commercial activity going on anymore at these international airport sites, there was little fear of any harm coming to non-combatants, and this also pertained to the Russians, who cared at least a little bit about American non-combatants, although if they were in the way, they were collateral damage. But for the PAP, they didn't care at all. They made no differentiation between Americans of any type and would equally annihilate them any chance that they got, unless they were given orders to capture instead of eliminate them, as the Russian forces generally tried their best to avoid civilian casualties if they could. If they were again in the way, then they were just in the way. But in this instance, there was little harm of that, as effectively the only forces that populated the international airport at this point were the paramilitary and military forces of the American side, who were defending the site. And again, as we go to the map, these areas shaded in here represent areas that had been earlier hit by artillery strikes from the sporadic strikes coming from the Russian and Chinese howitzers every so often, as there had been attempts to set up tent facilities in these fields where these shaded areas are, which had been hit by both Chinese and Russian sporadic strikes. However, at the opening of this battle, as the earlier sporadic strikes had kept most of the American Defense Forces pinned down inside of the buildings on the site, the forces had begun to come out the moment they could see that there were approaching Russian forces from their mechanized infantry battalions, as well as also the armored battalions as well, who now began to come down the airport road in terms of the tank companies, and even with them, behind them, the armored infantry companies, which were effectively the mechanized infantry forces within an armored battalion, but in companies, and their anti-tank companies of their BMP-T Terminator vehicles, which were very advanced tank busting and also even infantry busting vehicles, as they, like the Chinese QN-506, were fully capable of doing immense damage to infantry and armored forces just the same. We're all moving into the area as, again, Russian T-72s were now rolling down the airport road, and upon seeing, through their amazing optics, American vehicles such as the M113 APCs that had been given to the 1st of the 355th for their use, began to annihilate these vehicles at longer range. And of course, yes, they also had their Lancet III loitering munition support and would be receiving artillery support from both their own self-propelled 152mm 2S19 MSTA howitzers, as well as also the Chinese howitzers of the Type 59-I or -1s, firing their 130mm shells in support of Russian forces. Even there would be a Chinese Wing-Lung 2 dedicated combat drone operating in the area, destroying part of the QRF forces, and also there would be even a pair of Chinese JF-17Bs dropping precision ordnance along with massive artillery strikes. As one of the airport buildings would be effectively destroyed, the lieutenant colonel in charge of the battalion firing on this installation would be severely reprimanded for this, for effectively allowing his forces to destroy one of the airport buildings, because that's how important these facilities were to the coalition forces, the Chinese and Russians, as used as a mega fob after the invasion had concluded. As the fencing along the side of the airport facing west would be destroyed and run over, this berm, as there were many airports with berms like this that surrounded the main tarmac areas, runways, would be a fighting position for the infantry-based forces moving into the area, including vehicles that would be shelled immediately upon moving off of the runway and into this area, as others were moving out of the parking garage and through this gate that was open along this fence right here. As the shape of the runways of this airport, effectively, there was a runway that was on the western side, and there was also a runway on the eastern side just off this map. And the airport was now, by this point, fully surrounded, as there was a circular boulevard, or an elliptical boulevard almost, that moved into the main terminal building here, and there was also a light rail station inside of the building here as well, and also the parking garage in this area with overflow parking lots between the elliptical airport boulevard that led into the airport. As there would be vehicles coming out of the parking garage, as again, parking garages were actually a godsend for vehicles in terms of protecting them from artillery fires and other heavy weapons to an extent. Many of these vehicles had been preserved before this battle by getting them into the parking garage, just like had been done in Waco and many other concurrently unfolding battles, as this was a very common trend to use the most enduring civilian structures possible, like multi-floor parking garages, as the layers of steel-reinforced concrete were immensely thick and strong and resilient and could take a large pounding, as they were designed also to hold many tens of thousands of tonnage of vehicles. So they could certainly endure some punishment from some artillery shells and other weaponry that was, of course, even lighter than that. As the tanks moved into the area, and again, they, from a distance, had already knocked out all of these American vehicles, the M113s were easy pickings for the Russian T-72B3Ms moving into the area, as their 125 millimeter standard heat shells were more than a match for the lightly armored vehicles that were the M113 APCs, as this aluminum alloy armor was extremely weak, even prone to lighting into flames at times. And although, yes, it made the vehicle light, nimble, and fast in military vehicle terms, it was not a very well-protected vehicle. Even the Russian heavy machine guns, such as the DSHK 12.7 millimeter and other machine guns of this type that the Russians possessed, would shred effectively right through one of these vehicles. As they moved down the airport road and fired upon enemy forces with Frag T shells after first knocking out the vehicles, they would in effect hit some of these dismounted personnel running out of the main terminal building to engage them, but would effectively annihilate them with Frag T shells, as it would do minimal, if any, damage to the actual building itself, and any damage done by the Frag T shells was easily repairable. And as these tanks would effectively hold their position in the north of this one single tank company, as there was even more behind them of the same company, including their headquarters and support platoon of these T-72B3Ms that were attacking currently, as this was just one of 4 tank companies out of the entire armored battalion that was now to the north. These forces were also now accompanied by Russian mechanized infantry companies. There were 3 just operating in this area alone to the west of the airport, attacking beneath the 183 tollway highway. As they now moved beneath the tollway, they smashed through the flimsy chain link fencing that separated the airport from the rest of the city, and now began to move up and deploy their forces under heavy fire once they reached the berm. In terms of these vehicles, the vehicles like the MTLB APCs and the BMP-3s would pull right up to the berm and deploy their forces out from behind their vehicles and allow them to storm across the berm, although they would have first heavy artillery and even some air support in this area to knock out the defending forces. Although the defending forces, who had a TOW missile system, would knock out one of the MTLB APCs, but apart from that, there was not very many anti-tank weapons, as they were effectively a premium in the case of the Americans by this point, because they were spread very thinly after all the anti-tank weapons that had been given away to the Syrian civil conflict, as well as also most recently to the Great Eastern European proxy conflict, leaving America dangerously low on ATGMs. They effectively only had a small handful of TOW systems within the entire 1st of the 355th, as again, this was a training element that had been given some heavy weapons for the task of defending the airport. And before the invasion had occurred, the Americans had not known that they were about to be under a full-scale invasion. They had assumed that if anything happened with the Sino-Russian naval drills, that it would be a smaller scale attack in some sort of way. They didn't know if it would be embedded bad actors or agents doing the attacks, or they didn't know if it would be proxies doing the attacks. They didn't know if it would be limited air or missile strikes. They just didn't know. They had no idea that a full-scale invasion had effectively been set up underneath their nose for decades, and that pertained to most of the American population, minus, of course, those who had been caught by the Chinese MSS or Russian FSB in compromising positions and had to enact laws that benefited the coalition, especially China, in order to allow them to purchase properties and ports first, which was the first step by coercing the leadership into enacting these types of policies and laws, and then getting them to stay quiet about it with threats of exposure. And this is what had allowed the Chinese and their allies to build up for literal decades on American soil without so much as anything being said about it. Although there was plenty of activity that damn sure implied it to the fullest. And now it was paying dividends for the Chinese and their allies, as these Russian forces came in with their Su-34 extremely potent strike aircraft, each one, again, capable of carrying 26,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, and even the Chinese JF-17B fighters in a pair had come in to drop their limited numbers of air-to-ground ordnance, as they were primarily still armed with air-to-air munitions at this point, although they would be leaving the battle space for the second time before flying their third sortie, returning with mostly air-to-ground munitions, minus, of course, the 2 missiles, one on each wingtip, that would be kept for self-defense. Although by 8:30 a.m., the USAF had long since been knocked out of the war, as by largely 5 a.m., the deed had been done, and every single solitary aircraft that was airborne when the invasion had begun, or had tried to get airborne while it was going on, or was still on the ground, not even loaded up or fueled up, with maintenance having had been done on them, destroyed on the ground, methodically hunted down by the Chinese missile, air, and allied missile and air forces, not to mention the ground forces that had overrun them on the ground alongside of artillery strikes, besides just the air and missile strikes, as well as the artillery did enormous damage to parked aircraft, wiping them out completely. And the forces that overrun the air bases that got overran simply prevented any aircraft from being utilized whatsoever at all by the American forces, as by then it was too late once the installations had been thoroughly overran. Now that Russian forces, including their mechanized infantry forces, backed up by artillery and air power, both Chinese and of course their own, with their tanks moving south from north of the airport, their T-72B3Ms, had now effectively begun to overrun the airport. Even this Chinese Wingloong 2 combat drone is striking some of the QRF forces racing through the area from the other side of the airport, as they had been sitting on the runway, hence the reason why they were not yet destroyed, as some of the vehicles escaped destruction by simply being parked on the runways, and others by being inside of the parking garage, much like this grouping and this grouping. These were effectively 2 different American companies, Alpha and Bravo. Charlie and paramilitary troops were guarding the perimeter over in this direction, and Delta and more paramilitary elements were inside of this building, as well as their earlier having been paramilitary and military forces in small numbers destroyed, trying to establish tents on the airport grounds to consolidate their positioning for defending this place more long term. And they had effectively been wiped out completely. All of these loitering munitions were Russian Lancet 3s, and as they were fired 5 at a time from their 5-rail track-based mounted system, they were armed with different warheads. Some were armed with fragmentation warheads, while others were armed with HE, and others yet still were even armed with thermobaric or heat warheads, although those were in very small numbers, again because of the damage factor relating to the runways. They didn't want to do extensive damage to the runways whatsoever at all if it could be avoided. And these munitions being dropped were precision munitions, GLONASS-guided munitions, as were the Chinese Baidu-guided munitions being utilized in this area, although, again, with the artillery striking so close to this building, it would level the building, although the precision munitions would fall a bit further away and not damage the building or the runway infrastructure, but destroy these American trucks, which were used as logistical vehicles, including these 10 dismounted troops in two groupings right here, having had emerged from this building, and were now being hit. Again, there'd be a PAP lieutenant colonel called to the carpet and severely reprimanded for this by the colonel over the entire artillery regiment, as they did not even want a single building destroyed at all. But again, there would be hell to pay for that. Get a strong reprimand and a letter of reprimand, and if there were further mistakes, he would be demoted. As these forces were destroyed by the Winglung 2 dedicated combat drone, as well as all the strikes from loitering munitions, which, as most of these vehicles were soft-skinned vehicles that the Americans possessed, even the Russian fragmentation loitering munitions were enough to destroy those, but they would use their HE or even a few thermobarics on the MRAPs or on the M113 APCs, although they were largely destroyed by this point by tank shell fires. Also on this side by a very powerful airstrike from one of the Su-34s and the pair that had attacked the airport, as they dropped 8 GLONASS guided KAB 500S 1,000 pounders on this group. Technically over 1,000 pounds each, but rounding down, they're about 1,000 pounds, as 500 kilograms is about 1,200 pounds. As they destroyed these forces with both Chinese and their own artillery strikes from their 2S-19 MSTA howitzers, as well as also the 130mm towed howitzers of the Type 59-1-I varieties. These forces simply smashed their opponents, and as the Russian mechanized infantry troops had moved up to the berm and deployed their troops out of the backs of their vehicles, they were storming now the berm after the artillery and airstrikes had thoroughly concluded, including destroying these wedge formations here of QRF forces trying to move in from leaving the runway. They were hit immediately with these other forces behind the berm. Right as these platoons were moving up into the area, a whole combat company was in effect moving up here, and there was a whole combat company moving down the area here. This is just one platoon of one company, and they left a company in the center to lay down supporting fire for these movements on each of their flanks occurring right there. As they moved in, they again effectively got up to the berm and began to assault any survivors, as the loitering munition strikes, artillery strikes, and airstrikes were all too much, effectively. This group, upon leaving the runway, was hit by Chinese artillery right there, too, as Chinese and Russian artillery pounded this group, leaving the parking garage. There were effectively no reinforcements for these troops holding the line, although they had run effectively like hell, as the saying goes, to get to the berm, because they had to stay in the buildings for the most part, or in the parking garage, to maintain safety, or even being on the runways, because they knew after a certain extent of trial and error that the Chinese and Russians would not hit the runways themselves, because where they had set up their tents had been hit, and that let them know that they were taking extreme precaution to not destroy the runway infrastructure, nor the buildings, although again, this building was destroyed due to an overzealous commander allowing his forces to do it, but that was not, in effect, supposed to even happen like that. But anyways, with the loitering munition support, as the forces moved in and stormed the berms, they had overcome the berms, dealt with the survivors, and now prepared to bound and cover tactically together, as they bound ahead, then they bound ahead, then they bound ahead, then they bound. That's how they moved tactically, bounding and covering, towards the airport building, as some squads would remain outside as per standard building clearance procedures, waiting as a reserve force or to be able to catch anyone fleeing with sectors of fire that covered the building, as the last movement would be an entire company moving in from the south, as again, the entire airport facilities were totally surrounded by Russian forces of 3 entire battalions, 2 mechanized infantry, and 1 armored battalion that even sent in just one of their 4 tank companies. These forces moving up here, a company element, would send in 2 full platoons and leave 1 remaining outside of the airport as a QRF force of their own, as per building clearance procedures, again, to hold the outside sectors of fire, as 1 platoon, plus 2 more from the armored infantry company moving in to the south, would largely stay outside of the airport buildings, again, to watch the different sectors of fire, but would send in 2 additional squads from the south moving north into the building. They would take fire, all of them, as they tried to breach the building, and a 1-hour long battle with 200 inside of this facility, as the rest on the roof of this parking garage were totally annihilated by Chinese artillery, and of course there were Russian loitering munitions that flew into the openings of the parking garage and hit any forces that were still inside of these floors on the parking garage, allowing for these Russian forces to simply just go in and clear the airport building first. They would deal with this last, as it was fully already surrounded by this point. Effectively, what they would be doing when they checked the parking garage after they had captured the main terminal building would be a battle damage assessment because of their loitering munitions going in there and striking anybody that they even found. As again, due to the lack of activity in this airport, there were very few personal vehicles or cars of civilians that were located inside of the parking garage. Although some had been left in there, abandoned largely, mostly from the employees, including like this car right here on the road getting tore up by heavy machine gun fire. There was in effect really not that many vehicles inside the garage apart from the one time used by these military vehicles, but they were all thoroughly destroyed, and it was very easy, due to the lack of vehicles in the garage, for these loitering munitions to go in there and find anybody that was clad in military fatigues or even paramilitary attire, such as the standard khakis and black shirts and body armor worn by the paramilitary forces that were guarding this area. As they now, again, were engaged in a 1-hour-long firefight, building clearance, as they sent in the larger part of a company's combat elements, as 2 full platoons had entered, plus 2 squads from an entirely different company moving in from the south. The building fell by 10 a.m. So effectively, the battle had been fully won by 10 a.m. This was hit by a loitering munition strike. As again, loitering munitions were all throughout this area, even these going inside the parking garage, because these were all destroyed by tank shells, as there was no obstructions between these tanks and these APCs. They were easy to knock them out quick. So effectively, the Russians, along with their own artillery and their own air power, along with the assistance of Chinese artillery and air power as well, and even a combat drone, a Wing Loon 2, had successfully, in 1.5 hours' time, as it took 30 minutes to basically conduct all these movements and actions, combat actions outside, and 1 hour to take the main terminal building, they had effectively taken over the airport, intact, mostly, minus this one building, within an hour and a half. So by 10 a.m., the entire Austin battle in terms of at least the capture of key objectives, had been won. The Russians had seized the Rusty Allen Municipal Airport in Lago Vista. They had succeeded in destroying the American tech companies, which, by the way, at the time, again, were being defended by paramilitary forces sent there because they worked with DARPA and the DoD, so they were seen as important to national security, but they were destroyed by the Russian forces. There was also the immediate destruction of the 2nd of the 198th Battalion from the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team of the 36th ID of the Texas National Guard, which was the heaviest military formation on the map, destroyed by a combination of elements of this Russian armored battalion as well as a company from this PAP battalion that was guarding the rear flanks of another operation to surround and destroy a pocket of emerging armed civilians near the vital invasion route of I-35. The most vital invasion route in the entire south-central invasion sector, and it needed to be cleared all up and down its entire duration within these key nodes. In other words, the key nodes had to be completely under control because urban terrain was some of the most difficult terrain for extremely heavy, large, massive military formations like multiple PLA group armies to travel through. And if there was any type of obstruction, it could hold them up for many hours. And that could even be if they had a few of their light-skinned vehicles knocked out in an enormously long procession like that. That could never be allowed. That is why it was so vital to control everything along the key invasion route. As you see, all of these forces, all up and down I-35, were destroyed near immediately, if not immediately. And also, the headquarters of the 1st of the 355th was destroyed, just as this whole battalion was destroyed. Camp Maybury was a smoldering crater from all the missile, artillery, and airstrikes, and was simply occupied as a Russian combat engineer battalion, one of two, out of the two brigades making the 207th, just moved in and did a BDA and just occupied the area. The cap was taken, a very major objective, politically and symbolically, at least for this battle. And also the downtown was captured by the PAP, with Russian forces supporting just to the south as they had to clear the south of Austin. As the red zone was now taken, the mega fob taken, the 250th Construction Battalion of the Chinese Paramilitary National Construction Corps would move in and begin building a mega fob, leaving only one company to occupy and continue building up what they had already begun to build up on the Austin Municipal as a satellite fob of what would become the mega fob and Laogai complex in the Austin Bergstrom International Airport. Just as Russian combat engineer forces from this battalion, including its headquarters and support company, as they had left two companies, one combat and their headquarters and support, to guard the pontoon bridge, they would send one of their companies, leaving the headquarters and support to maintain the pontoon bridge, to begin constructing the fob in Lago Vista. As by now, after having had secured all of this, all they would really need, their headquarters troops were enough to hold this bridge. As Austin had been thoroughly captured by this point, and even this battle to the immediate southeast of the Austin Bergstrom battle had concluded by now, with People's Armed Police Forces routing the armed civilian bands that had materialized and now were on the run, themselves moving toward a town called Creedmoor near another outer-laying suburb known as Buda. These forces would pursue, engage, and destroy an even larger element fleeing from vengeful Serbs of the Serb First Army, which was attached to the Russian Second Combined Arms Army and under their command, along with the 3rd Venezuelan Infantry Brigade, and even a Nicaraguan combat battalion, all operating to the south in the San Antonio battle. But the Serbs had sent some of their battalions to clear New Braunfels before moving into the Kyle area, which is what caused this grouping of about 1,000 to flee north and would be joined by nearly a few hundred additional fleeing from the PAP battalion, who was now pursuing them as they hurriedly fled the area. The destruction in this battle was enormous, and it was not even over yet, as there was still more combat left on the horizon, as American civilian militia groups and ordinary armed reactionary civilian elements trying to band together would launch a small series of disjointed, ad hoc counterattacks that would all fail miserably, as the forces, again, that they were up against had total firepower dominance, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance dominance, and artificial intelligence dominance, which guided the forces in their movements, even putting together pre-prepared strike packages for their artillery and air power and missile forces, making the coalition military forces the deadliest by far invasion force in the history of humankind, as they moved with near impunity, with no real forces in their way able to stop them from achieving their set out objectives. The Battle of Austin will continue in the next video with the battle for Creedmoor next.